It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Maplewood Park. Golden leaves drifted to the ground, and laughter from children playing on the jungle gym filled the air. Families lounged on picnic blankets, while the distant clink of a hot dog cart and an occasional bark added to the serene backdrop. At the edge of this tranquility, a man sat alone on a weathered bench. Elliot Graham, with his silver-rimmed glasses and graying beard, seemed unremarkable, except for the red baseball cap on his head. Its bold white letters stood out like a challenge. MAGA. Elliot seemed undisturbed by the attention his hat drew. He flipped through a small notebook, his face calm, occasionally breaking into a faint smile as if he were lost in a pleasant memory. To him, this was just another day, quiet and reflective. But for some, the sight of the cap was jarring. Lila Carter tightened her grip on the leash of her Labrador. Bella, her footsteps faltering when she caught sight of the cap. Her chest tightened and a familiar rush of irritation coursed through her. It wasn't fear, it was anger laced with disbelief. How could someone wear that here, in her park, in this community? To her, it was more than a piece of clothing. It was a statement, a provocation. Bella barked and wagged her tail, oblivious to her owner's growing tension. Lila barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on Elliot, scrutinizing him from a distance. He didn't seem dangerous. He didn't even seem aware of her presence. But the hat, that hat, it spoke louder than any words could, and it unsettled her. She glanced around, searching for validation among the other park-goers. A group of young mothers nearby whispered to one another, occasionally glancing in Elliot's direction. An older man sitting on a neighboring bench shook his head, muttering under his breath. Lila felt a pang of solidarity. She wasn't the only one who noticed. She wasn't the only one uncomfortable. Her heart pounded as she weighed her options. She could walk away, ignore it, and let the moment pass. But something inside her, pride, principle, or perhaps the weight of unspoken expectations, urged her to act. She had always considered herself someone who stood up for her beliefs, and today would be no exception. With a sharp exhale, Lila squared her shoulders. Bella barked again, tugging at the leash as if urging her owner to move. Lila tightened her grip, her steps deliberate as she made her way toward the bench where Elliot sat. She would say something, anything to make her stance clear. Lila's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as she approached the bench, her Labrador tugging at the leash, oblivious to the tension brewing in her owner's chest. She hesitated for a brief moment when she reached him, her shadow falling over the bench. Elliot glanced up, his calm brown eyes meeting hers briefly before he returned his focus to the notebook in his hands. "Excuse me," Lila said, her voice sharper than she intended. She cleared her throat, steadying herself. "Is that really necessary?" She pointed at the cap, her eyes narrowing as she waited for his reaction. Elliot blinked, lifting his head fully this time. His expression was neutral, almost serene, as if he were assessing whether she was addressing him at all. "Pardon me," he said, his tone polite but cautious. "That hat," she said, her voice gaining volume. "Do you really think it's appropriate to wear something like that here? In a public park? Around families?" Elliot raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly on the bench. His fingers rested on the edges of his notebook, his posture unthreatening. "I wasn't aware hats came with restrictions," he replied evenly. His calmness caught Lila off guard. She had expected defensiveness, maybe even hostility. Instead, his response felt almost dismissive, as if her words didn't warrant concern. That only fueled her frustration. "It's not just a hat," she snapped. "It's a symbol of hate and division." Elliot's gaze didn't waver. "It's a hat," he repeated quietly. "I'm just sitting here, enjoying the park like everyone else." Lila's jaw tightened. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the nearby crowd. A few people paused their strolls, turning to watch the exchange. A teenager leaned against a tree, his phone held up discreetly, its camera unmistakably pointed in their direction. Lila could feel their eyes on her, some encouraging, others critical. It was both an audience and a jury. "You're making people uncomfortable," she said, her voice rising slightly. "That hat represents everything this community isn't. You're not just sitting here, you're sending a message, and it's not welcome." Elliot sighed softly, closing his notebook with a deliberate slowness. "Ma'am, I'm not here to bother anyone," he said. "I came to enjoy the park, just like you." Lila's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white as she fought the urge to shout. His calmness, his refusal to engage at her level, felt like a dismissal of everything she stood for. "You're provoking people," she insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you even care about the impact of what you're doing?" Elliot looked around the park, his eyes scanning the curious faces of onlookers. He let out a slow breath and turned back to her. "I'm sorry if my presence bothers you," he said, his voice as steady as before. "But I have every right to be here." Lila felt her chest tighten, her pulse hammering in her ears. The crowd was growing, their whispers louder, and she could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her. She had started this, and now there was no turning back. Her gaze flicked to a pair of young mothers on a nearby blanket. One of them gave a small nod, her expression supportive. It was enough to steel Lila's resolve. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice firm but trembling slightly. She pulled her phone from her pocket, holding it up as if to show she was serious. "This is a public park, and you're disrupting the peace." Elliot's eyes softened, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "Disrupting the peace," he repeated almost to himself. He shook his head lightly but said nothing more, his composure unwavering. And the crowd murmured louder now, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. Some onlookers seemed intrigued, others uneasy. A few quietly walked away, unwilling to be part of the unfolding drama. The teenager with the phone stepped closer, his camera capturing every moment. Lila's fingers hovered over the screen, her chest heaving as she wrestled with a mix of anger and doubt. She glanced back at Elliot, who remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his notebook. He looked at her, not with anger or defiance, but with something that unnerved her more: pity. The distant sound of sirens sliced through the murmur of the crowd, growing louder with every passing second. Lila stood rigid, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had committed to, the line she had crossed. Around her, the tension was palpable, a mix of curiosity, unease, and quiet judgment. Elliot remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back slightly on the bench, his notebook resting on his lap. The only sign of his awareness was the faint sigh that escaped his lips, almost inaudible against the growing hum of the crowd. The police cruiser pulled up to the park's edge, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms sharp against the backdrop of autumn leaves. They surveyed the scene quickly, their eyes settling on the small group gathered near the bench. The taller of the two, a man with a no-nonsense air, approached first, while his partner, a younger woman with a steady gaze, followed closely behind. Lila stepped forward, her voice tinged with urgency as she waved them over. "Officers, thank you for coming," she began, pointing at Elliot. "That man over there has been causing a disturbance. He's wearing that hat," she nearly spat the word, "and he's making people here uncomfortable. I think he's trying to provoke us." The male officer held up a hand, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, we'll take it from here," he said, his tone measured. He turned toward Elliot, who was already looking at them with quiet curiosity. "Sir," the officer began as they approached the bench, "we received a call about a potential disturbance. Do you mind telling us what's going on?" Elliot looked up, offering a polite nod. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. "I've just been sitting here, reading and enjoying the park. I wasn't aware I was causing any trouble." The younger officer glanced at his notebook, then at the hat perched on his head. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing slightly as if piecing something together. She leaned toward her partner and murmured something low enough that Lila couldn't hear. The male officer frowned briefly, then turned back to Elliot. "Sir, can I ask your name?" he said, his tone shifting subtly, almost respectful. Elliot straightened slightly, his hands folding neatly over the notebook. "Elliot Graham," he replied, his voice carrying just enough weight to suggest that it wasn't a name pulled from obscurity. The younger officer's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the growing murmurs of the crowd. "You're Dr. Elliot Graham, aren't you? The professor who spoke at the community forum last month?" Elliot nodded modestly. "I am." A ripple of whispers passed through the onlookers. Lila's stomach sank. She blinked, trying to process the words. Professor? Community forum? Her mind scrambled to connect the dots. The male officer turned to Lila, his expression harder to read now. Ma'am, he said carefully, are you aware of who Mr. Graham is? He's a prominent advocate for public discourse and inclusivity. He's spoken extensively on bridging divides in communities like this one. Lila's throat went dry. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of her assumptions crashed over her like a wave. She had called the police on a man whose work aligned, ironically, with everything she claimed to stand for. The younger officer stepped closer to Elliot. I'm sorry you've been inconvenienced, Dr. Graham, she said, her voice carrying a note of respect. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Elliot smiled faintly, shaking his head. No apology needed, he said. I understand that symbols carry weight. It's all about perspective. The officers turned back to Lila, who stood frozen, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some voices tinged with laughter, others with quiet disapproval. A young woman near the front shook her head, muttering, Unbelievable, as she walked away. Lila began, but her voice faltered. She looked at Elliot, who had risen to his feet, his presence commanding, yet unthreatening. He didn't look angry, only disappointed. Sometimes, Elliot said softly, addressing no one in particular, we see what we want to see, not what's actually in front of us. His eyes met Lila's briefly, and she felt the sting of his words as if they had been spoken directly to her. The officers stepped back, signaling that the matter was resolved. Have a good day, Dr. Graham, the male officer said, tipping his cap slightly. Elliot nodded and picked up his notebook, turning toward the path leading out of the park. Lila stood rooted to the spot, her dog tugging lightly at the leash. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to justify her actions somehow, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she watched as Elliot walked away, the red cap still perched on his head, a quiet but powerful reminder of her mistake. As the crowd dispersed, Lila felt the weight of their lingering stares. Her chest tightened, a mix of humiliation and regret settling deep within her. She had wanted to make a stand, to defend her community. Instead, she had revealed something uncomfortable about herself. Do you think symbols like hats or clothing carry too much weight in public spaces? Or should we focus more on the actions and intentions behind them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel. It means a lot.